Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live again from Film Fanatic headquarters. It's 10:41, so I hope everyone's doing good. It is Monday. Well, it was sunny. It was a pretty day for about a few minutes. Now it's back to being pretty cloudy. Yesterday was Mother's Day. I hope everyone got to spend time with probably the most important person on in our lives, and that's our mothers. And so I had a nice dinner over at my family's with my mom, and we watched a couple of movies. So that's our tradition. And the next couple of shows, I'm going to be doing some videos on the movies I watched. So first up, the first movie I'm going to talk about is a movie that just came out, and that is called Heart Eyes. It came out in 2025. It just came out recently. It wasn't in the. That's one thing I notice now is when movies get a theatrical release, it's like they don't. They're not in the theaters very long, and then bam, they are. Well, a lot of the times they don't get a digital release, or they don't get a physical media release, or there's this super long delay. But immediately after the release of a movie in the theater, it goes right to streaming, or in this case, they put out physical media, and that's the case with Heart Eyes. It had no. I think it did fairly well in the box office. This movie got a lot of press. I heard about this movie for months before it came out. It was deemed. I saw the trailer for it um, quite a while ago in the theater. It might have been when I saw the Hugh Grant movie Heretic. I saw that in the theater, and I think I saw the Heart Eyes trailer then, and that was quite a while ago. That was in the middle of winter. It was months ago, and I saw the trailer for Heart Eyes then, and I've heard so much about it since then. A lot of people have been talking about it, and it was kind of when I saw the trailer, I was like, oh, it looks pretty good. It looks like a cool kind of modern day slasher film. And so today's show is going to be on Hard Eyes. I finally rented it. I actually I had, or have been kind of excited to see it. But in the end, I almost did see it in the theater, and I'm really glad I did not see it in the theater. Because ultimately, I did not like this movie really in any way, shape, or form. So I'm going to be talking about Hard Eyes, and I'm going to talk about all of the hype around it, or the campaign. This movie had a big campaign around it as far as trailers and all kinds of things on the internet. It's in the marketing, and this movie was kind of billed, or as a slasher film, but actually it is, and then it's not really. It's really. The heart of this film for Hard Eyes, I would have to say it's kind of like a romantic comedy, like a date movie with slasher elements, or the 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 internal parts of this film. It is essentially a date movie, kind of a battle of the sexes kind of a movie, a romantic comedy, if you will. But then the exterior of it is a slasher film, and maybe even saying I might even calling the exterior of this movie a slasher movie might be a little bit too much. So the cast, the cast were all people I was not aware of. Pretty decent cast, um, pretty solid for the most part. It was directed by Josh Rubin, who I have no idea who that is. Olivia Holt and Mason Gooding are the stars of this film. And basically, the film is centered on them. They are the two kind of protagonists. They are the love. They are the couple that is, forming this bond, and eventually kind of fall in love with each other. And, it's one of those cases, like, the design of Heart Eyes, of the character itself is actually kind of cool. This movie definitely has. Well, it's interesting because I talk a lot. I've done a lot of videos on giallo movies, which is one of my favorite kind of subgenres in the kind of exploitation world, and also related to the horror world and slasher world, of course. Love that genre, and this movie has a little bit of those elements. I'm kind of surprised. So there's lots of scenes with Heart Eyes with where he's walking down a long hallway, or there's shots of his gloved hands with the knife. Very giallo that way, but other than that, it's not related to that beloved genre at all. But there is like there definitely is there's definitely influences. It's kind of funny, but I guess kind of cool. I mean, to see that those films, that amazing genre of filmmaking, still has an influence even on uh, pop movies. I consider this movie to be a big, even though this movie probably didn't have this incredibly massive budget, but I feel that this movie is like a big budget Hollywood, a big Hollywood, a big bloated, Hollywood version of the slasher movie. That's the only way I can kind of describe it. And it's the case which happens so often, and I'm sick and tired of it happening in a lot of new modern movies where you have a really good, either it's a really good and exciting opening or a really solid introduction to the story, and like the scenario where you have the first 15 to 20 minutes of a film is great, and you're like, wow, okay, this could be cool. I'm into this. And then after that, and once you get to the second act, you check out of the movie, and it just completely goes off the fucking rails in almost every way possible, to where the story and everything gets so convoluted, so illogical, and so unbelievable, and everything that's kind of established in the first 20 minutes or so of the movie gets thrown out, and everything that's kind of good, the tone, where you feel it's going to go, and it's enough to where, especially in the beginning of this film, it's enough to where you're introduced to Heart Eyes, and there's a couple of good, like, suspenseful kind of chase scenes. There's some good kills. It's pretty good. It's like, okay, when we started watching it last night, I was like, yep, this is kind of cool. And then it goes into a much different direction, which I did not expect. I did hear that this movie was more of a, or definitely had big time elements of like a romantic comedy. That this movie was supposedly funny as well. Um, but and it is the comedy is, once you get into the second act, you start realizing, oh wait, this is not what I expected. This is more of a straight up kind of romantic comedy. And I love it when you can take different genres and blend them together. I think it can be done really, really successful. I think Prisoners. I think that the movie that just recently came out called Sinners, which I did a review on, and I had some pretty mixed things with that movie. That movie was like, took a lot of different elements as an example of different genres, and I think for the most part did a really good job. But ultimately, I felt there were some things in that movie that I was not really impressed by. That movie was much better. I mean, granted, a completely different style of a film. That both are definitely horror films, but that Sinners was a better example of where you're doing something a lot more. Doing some The director, the filmmakers are doing something ambitious, and they're trying to combine different elements, different genres, and for the most part, that movie did a good job with blending those genres. But with Heart Eyes, They do until it spirals out of control. And when you get to the second and third act, after the opening, everything is so anticlimactic. The there's no there's no intensity around the kills, or especially around the killer, Heart Eyes. There's no tension anymore. It's all let out of the bag, and it's due to, like, you start to realize that this film is a comedy, and it's kind of cute, it's kind of funny, it's quirky, and but I feel like they're trying so hard to kind of like make this movie so contemporary that it gets bogged down with those very things. But it's kind of cool. It's kind of funny again, and I think there's I will say there's a moment, or there's a few moments in this film where I feel like the two main characters, there is a real true kind of chemistry between the two of them. And but that was the only thing I took away from this movie that I thought was pretty good. And it reaches a point of where the comedy is so overly used, and virtually every joke, if you will, is dead on arrival. Like, where it's just not funny, and they're trying to, like, all the bells and whistles, everything, every possible trope that you could see in a romantic comedy is thrown in this movie. Like, literally every conceivable fucking trope that we've seen over the decades is thrown in this movie, and there's no restraint. There's no levity, and it gets so bogged down with that I feel like all of the slasher elements that we are introduced to the movie, particularly around the suspense and tension, gone, gone, totally gone, and it becomes secondary. And then there are scenes in this film. Again, this movie has some pretty good kills. The opening sequence is pretty good. Um, there's some pretty decent kills. There's one really good kill towards the end of the film, but there's no tension. There's, like, because of the comedic nature of this movie, and that it's literally just it reaches a point where it's just overkill, and it just overshadows everything. And the jokes at the end of the day, I just feel, are just not funny. It's just not funny. It's just dead air. They could be saying anything. And it goes nowhere. And so this movie gets so bogged down by this unnecessary bullshit. And I just don't get it. I don't get what they were doing. Like, how did this movie get financed? How did this movie get a theatrical run? Like, I just don't understand. And it just felt like this movie, the writers, the whole movie, but mainly the way the script was written, that they were trying so hard to, like, make it hip and cool and uber contemporary. And it's, I just want a good story. I just want some interesting characters. I want some if I'm watching a slasher movie, I want some suspense. Even if it's something that's formulaic and like a typical straight ahead slasher film, I can dig that. But I feel like that didn't happen. I felt like they were trying so hard to make this quirky and very contemporary, and putting it in this very kind of contemporary light of what it's like to date in 2025. And it's that battle of the sexes kind of a movie. You think of, like, I think of a classic movie that dealt with that kind of world, perfectly, as a movie with Michael Douglas, War of the Roses, and Danny DeVito. Super funny, super dark comedy, but just brilliant. And it did such a great job because the writing was so good, and it's actually funny. So, and I don't feel like they were trying to do something. It just felt organic. And this movie does not. The dialogue and the themes and the tones of this movie, nothing feels organic. It just feels forced. And they're trying to make it into something it's not quite there. That it's not. And the biggest issue I have with this movie is I have to say, I'm not a fan of really any slasher movies that came out in the 90s. And this movie is it's funny because it's so marred down with, I feel like, again, with the script and kind of the filmmakers were so obsessed or trying so hard to make this uber contemporary, with what it's like dating in 2025. But the setting and the whole world, it feels like it's a total like 90s slasher movie. And I think, with the exception of, and there were so many, and I don't know, I don't really consider them slasher movies, but they're called slasher movies. But there were so many slasher movies that came out in the 90s that were just crap and just void of anything that I find interesting in a real true slasher movie. And the only exception I really make with that is, like, I'm a big fan of Wes Craven, and I think Scream, the first Scream, is a really awesome movie. That movie was really important because at that time when that movie came out, the horror genre itself was kind of dying. It was not doing very well. It wasn't making any money. You still had the underground films that were going, but as far as commercial, the commercial appeal and movies that just had traction in the box office, like, it was kind of dying. And that movie single-handedly changed horror and kind of reintroduced horror to a mass audience. But still, but I think what that movie did, what Wes Craven did with that film, was he did something really different, paid homage to a lot of the classic slasher movies that came before, and had a good balance, breaking the third wall, and making fun of itself, but having fun and actually making it scary. That's a really great movie. And I think the second Scream movie is also really, really good. And I continued that kind of a thing. And that was also directed by Wes Craven. After that, I could care less about any of the other Scream movies. I think they are just generic and pointless. Those are the only movies that I liked that I can recall offhand from the 90s that were called slasher movies. And the reason I don't like slasher movies from the 90s, and again, this is my opinion, and I'm only talking about this from a stronger point of view just because the slasher genre and slasher films are my favorite genre of all time. Particularly, the classic 70s, the best decades, 70s and 80s. You can't, to me, that's my bread and butter. That's my jam. And the thing that I don't like, and what the thing I don't like about this movie, and why this is labeled a slasher movie, and why it feels so 90s to me, is because everybody in this film is just too pretty. They all look like centerfold models. Everything is so clean, everything is so glossy, and has this, like, really immaculate production value. And to me, all of those qualities are trash. And I feel like none of those qualities belong in a really good slasher movie at all. Like, if you watch any of the classic slasher movies from the 70s and 80s, they're all gritty as fuck. The kids in the movies look like real kids. They look like real people. Um, they're kind of sleazy. Uh, Copious amounts of gore, but the teenagers look like the teenagers next door. They don't look like GQ models, and that's the thing. And any of the classic slasher films like Pieces or The Burning or Black Christmas, people look like real people. They're not. It's not so glossed up and so pretty. And and they're kind of sleazy. They're a little bit dirtier, and they're a little bit rough around the edges. And there's a lot of imagination. And 90s slasher films, I feel like, had none of that. They were all just like, kind of like if McDonald's decided to put out mass a mass consumption version of the slasher film. Like that's all it was. You take certain elements, you take a genre, but then you just really dumb it down and water it down, and then put it out there in the world for mass consumption. And that's what this movie is to me. So I really didn't like this movie. The only thing I felt like that was kind of cool and that I thought was there was that there was a point in the story where the two main characters, you do feel like they have a chemistry. There is a sparkle, there is some fire between the two of them. But other than that, everything else you can just throw out into the trash and then set it on fire. Yeah, I wouldn't waste my time with this movie. Don't believe the hype. I did hear, there have been a plethora of different reviews, and there were a lot of people saying that this movie was really great, and then there were a lot of people saying that this movie was okay, but it was really flawed. But no thanks, no thank you. And there's a reviewer that I kind of can't stand watching him anymore. I don't know why I watch his show anymore. I should just I should just stop. Who reviewed this movie, and he said more or less the same things that I'm saying, kind of. But he said one thing to me, or well, not one thing to me, but one thing that I just was like outraged by. And again, opinions are opinions, and I want people to have a different opinion. But I'm just like, there's a point of where you draw a line, and you're like, this guy just has no idea what he's talking about. He is so off the rails, and he has no idea what he's talking about. And I don't want to mention his name, but he was talking about how he really loves kind of newer versions or remakes of classic slasher movies, and he was saying how much you know this movie is technically a Valentine's Day movie or a date movie, and that the holiday of Valentine's Day needed more slasher movies because there aren't really any good ones. And he was saying on how he didn't really like My Bloody Valentine, the original Canadian slasher movie, and that he really loved the 3D version of that came out, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago, which is absolutely an atrocity. It's a complete piece of shit. And he totally trashed the original My Bloody Valentine, which for me is one of the greatest fucking movies ever and one of the greatest slasher movies ever made. And I'm just like, fuck this guy. I'm not going to watch his channel anymore. But anyway, I would pass on Hard Eyes. If you want 15 minutes of relatively decent fun, then maybe watch it and then turn it off. But yeah, don't waste your time. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.